We've shared with you stories about World War II veterans who served aboard the B-17, known as the Flying Fortress. Of course, the B-17 holds a prominent place in our state's World War II history because it was manufactured by the Boeing Company. But the American bomber produced in greater numbers than any other combat aircraft during the war was the B-24 Liberator. Seattle veteran George Kuchenbecker wants people to know about the history of the B-24 and how it helped to win the war in Europe.
He'd sit out here or out there at our altitude.
Thank you so much, George.
You're welcome. They were always open, even at altitude where it was 40 below. Windows were always open.
George Kuchenbecker is in his element.
That's a gun. 50 caliber Browning.
He's a former B-24 tail gunner and proud of it.
He doesn't realize, but the B-24 was a much better airplane, but he'll never admit it.
Who won the war? The B-17?
You got to be out of your tree.
Wearing his original flight suit and cap and carrying his leather helmet, the 81-year-old came to Everett's Payne Field to mark the Wings of Freedom tour of World War II aircraft, brought here by the Massachusetts-based Collings Foundation and featuring the only B-24 in the world still flying these days.
This leather is 60-some years old, and it's getting a little delicate. When we come from the back.
For George, it's a chance to share his wartime experiences with a younger generation, along with his first-hand knowledge of the B-24, a warbird that played a critical role in liberating Europe.
We flew faster, and we flew farther, and we carried a heavier bomb load.
George Kuchenbecker was a 17-year-old Minnesota high school student when the war broke out. With his mother's permission, George and a buddy went down to the enlistment office and joined up.
We're going to go fight for our country, but not realizing what the consequences of that might be.
After boot camp in Mississippi and gunnery school in Texas, George knew he wanted to fly. He eventually ended up at an air base in Walla Walla. There he was assigned to a B-24 crew, a crew that would stay together until the end of the war. So how did you become a tail gunner?
Need a tail gunner. You look pretty good, George. Get in there.
But the deadly reality of war hit home quickly when the crew arrived at Pantanella Airfield in southern Italy, home base for the 464th and 465th Bomb Groups of the 15th Air Force. The crew took over a hut of another crew that was out on a bombing run.
Late in the day, the adjutant and the chaplain came to collect all their personal effects because they had been shot down. So, 8 hours on base and I run into my first real tragedy. Other than our own crew, we probably didn't pay too much attention to the names of the other guys because it was too hard to lose them if you knew them. So if you didn't know their name, then you didn't know them. It was sort of a rule of thumb, so to speak. Hang on just a second.
The B-24 flew with a 10-man crew. It carried up to 7,000 pounds of bombs, machine guns, ammunition, and oxygen. With all that weight, takeoffs and landings could be as perilous as the bombing runs. From Pantanella, the bombers would fly 8 to 12-hour missions into Germany, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans. Their main targets were oil refineries, along with aircraft plants, munition factories, railroad yards, and docks.
The thrust of the 15th Air Force was you got to get Hitler's oil. If you can get his oil, he can't run his trucks, he can't run his airplanes, and he can't run his tanks, if you can just stop his oil.
But to do so, the B-24s had to fend off German fighters. and anti-aircraft fire called flak, high-velocity shells that were altitude-sensitive, usually exploding at 20,000 feet. Flak could and often did bring down a B-24.
It never quits until you get out of range.
It was flak that created the most dangerous experience of the war for George and his crewmates. It happened on a bombing run to Vienna, Austria. Flak took out an engine, crippling the aircraft. After dropping its bombs, the crew furiously scrambled to get rid of any extra weight to aid its 3 remaining engines.
We had to clear 12,000-foot Alps, which means that you had to have the throttles up, you had to have the manifold pressure up, you had to have everything up so you could struggle and get over the Alps, and then you could kind of slide on down.
To lighten the load, George threw out all of his ammunition boxes, which back at the base didn't sit well with his superiors.
Do you realize how hard it is to get those boxes? And I said, do you realize how hard it is to get me out of a snowbank in the Alps someplace?
George and his crew carried out and survived 13 bombing missions. At the end of the war, he was just 20 years old. He returned to Minnesota, met a pretty girl from his hometown, and married her, starting a new life that eventually brought him to the Northwest.
Now, you know what this is?
The oxygen.
Oxygen. See, and after you pass 10,000 feet, no oxygen, no life.
These days, George Kuchenbecker is on a final mission to tell the story of the B-24, and more importantly, to make sure that people never forget what he and many others were willing to do more than 60 years ago to keep this country free.
It's a significant reminder of what we as a country can do if we put our backs to it and say, okay, let's get it done.
The B-24 was held in high regard by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. During the war, Churchill used a B-24 as his personal transport aircraft.